Thanks for watching. My name is Jason Barney. Public Access has invited a group of panelists together today to talk about Martin Luther King Day. Over the next hour, several current event and public issues will be coming up, and the panel will be discussing them in depth and a very conversational way. I'd like to introduce the panelists today. We have Roy Hill, the former appointee for the Governor's Workforce Equity Diversity Council and served as the Vermont rep to the National Black Leadership Summit. We have Allie Johnson-Kurtz, Communications Director for Change the Story Vermont. Rhoni Basden, Executive Director for Vermont Works for Women. And Jeff Benay, Director of Indian Education in the Missisquoi Valley Union District. So I think I'd like to start off by just giving you each the opportunity to introduce yourselves and let the watchers know your history. And if you could also mention what you think of how we celebrate the Martin Luther King Day holiday. Roy?
Thank you. And I want to thank my panelists here for being here on this special occasion. There's a biblical statement that we're at the right time, at the right date to make the right statement. I think this is critical that we symbolically recognize what King stood for. Yes, he was Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., first and foremost. I think that people may get lost in the weeds when they look at things such as, yes, he was Dr. King, and yes, he was Nobel laureate, but he spoke to the human condition and love for those in the family, this one human family, this 8 billion people, we who populate the planet Earth. And I think the thinking and the listening and the hearing and learning are so necessary because there's evil in terms of sin that we call racism, the abuse of our brothers and sisters, even children. If we read current media that says, and we remembered, that we can do better. A program of this sort is a reminder, it's educational, it's instructional in terms of the things that we can do better because we're all so skilled and talented. But loving oneself and loving others make a difference.
Allie?
My name is Allie Johnson-Kurtz. I work with Change the Story Vermont, which is a gender equity initiative to promote women's economic security in Vermont, and that means all women, and women of all races, all abilities, of all ages. And so it's important to me to be here today to celebrate Martin Luther King Jr.'s life and to recognize that the work that he was part of is ongoing and continues, and want to be part of that and do in my volunteer work outside of my paid work with Showing Up for Racial Justice, the Central Vermont chapter as well, which is around organizing white people to take action on issues of racism in our home communities, and so bringing that perspective as well. I also am coming from an international climate change activism background, working with people from around the world and connecting with folks in the global south in particular who are most impacted by some of the crises that we're seeing today. And so thinking about the ways that all of these issues are interconnected and are falling hardest on folks who are not white. And so bringing that in today, and want to continue the work that is being done around civil rights in Vermont right here.
Rhoni?
So I am Rhoni Basden. I'm the Executive Director of Vermont Works for Women, and we work with women and girls across the state to really help them explore and empower them to look at opportunities for different careers that they can take on to really build financial independence for themselves and for their families. So really working with some of our highest or most vulnerable populations and some of our highest need demographics across the state to really make sure that they have exposure and opportunity and mentorship to be successful as they navigate their life, starting at a young age. I bring to the table a history growing up in Vermont, but then for the past 15 years having the opportunity to live all across the United States and to really see a lot of our communities and what they're working with and how systematically they're all dealing with the same struggles, maybe at different levels and different parts of the conversation, but being able to bring to the table in Vermont some of that experience in working with Vermont Works for Women, growing our impact across the state to reach more women and girls, and to really continue to keep the idea of gender equity, and especially for women of color and girls of color at the forefront of the conversation as well, to know how they're impacted at some of the highest degrees with some of the systems that are in place in our local communities and statewide. So I look forward to being here and having this conversation and feel it's an important day that we continue this conversation.
Yeah.
My name is Jeff Benay. I'm Director of Indian Education for Franklin County Public Schools. That's Franklin County, Vermont, where I've been in this position for several decades. I was the chair of the Governor's Advisory Commission on Native American Affairs, having served Howard Dean for 5 terms, Jim Douglas for 2 terms, and I retired from that position. We work with approximately 612 Abenaki students enrolled in 9 school districts in this area, which I think surprises a lot of people when they hear the numbers. I often talk about Missisquoi Valley Union High School, where you, Jason, are a teacher, and people are surprised to hear the numbers, that 36 to 38% are Abenaki, and that surprises people, especially in a state perceived to be as homogeneous as Vermont. And that's one of the reasons why today is so important. Anytime we have the opportunity to celebrate diversity in Vermont is very, very important. How we go about celebrating it, I mean, hopefully we're going to talk about what goes on in school systems, for instance, where it's so important. The fact is, in Vermont schools, kids are off. That's an obscenity, as far as I'm concerned. Kids in Vermont don't know much about Martin Luther King, and yet they have a day to do whatever they want. They should be in school where they're learning about who Martin Luther King was. But that's a discussion for a little later on. But in any case, for the Abenaki, this is 40 years celebration and commitment to social justice and equity. So something like this dovetails really nicely with what the Abenaki have been doing and what they're all about around diversity. So I'm pleased to be here. I'm pleased to be here with the guests. I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for coming. Thank you all for being here. So the first question is one that Jeff hit on, and as a public school teacher, I'll mention what you brought up as far as Martin Luther King Day and how education celebrates that day. So Missisquoi Valley Union has in service today, and my administration was kind enough to let me come and participate in this. I understand there are some school districts that are in session today, and then there are some that are not. So that's how Martin Luther King is directly, or the day is directly impacting my schedule. But it is something that we do cover in the classroom, social studies teachers in particular. How does this holiday weave into your current work, Roy?
It weaves into my current work on perhaps 3 levels. One, that perhaps is the most important, is my opportunity to interact with students, especially in Fairfax, because the profile of Dr. King's work is lifted up by a number of teachers there, in particular Ben Soros, and I appreciate and am available to answer questions, honest questions about a number of students because, as Jeff just indicated, there are students who know not of Dr. King. It's kind of like ancient history, but he stood for, as we know, justice issues, equity issues, and those are current. Whether we look at police profiling, we look at the fact that our Vermont Supreme Court in 2018 supported the KKK here in Vermont. How do those precedents of negativity in the past impact our need for progress that brings about more righteousness, more self-respect? So in that respect, I make myself available to interact with students, interact with parents, and interact with people in the faith community. Just yesterday, as an example, I spoke twice on this theme. Where do we go from here? I spoke at the Trinity Episcopal Church there in Shelburne. So there are a number of people who've had experiences, and they sit back. A number of them who are retired, they sit back because our system doesn't bring to the forefront their experience and their credibility. Their credibility has a voice because they are members of the community, although silent, because often avenues that don't provide us with the platform, such as this platform, to articulate, to challenge the thinking potential that's there, to challenge the skills which are there, which say, hey, let's have a civilized dialogue. You may remember, or my colleagues and I will underscore the fact that just a few years ago in South Burlington High School, one of the students, Isaiah Hines, raised the question about the integrity, maintaining a Southern discussion around honoring a Southern tradition. And there were adults, white adults, who threatened his very life because he called for dialogue and conversation. If you don't have dialogue, if you don't have conversation, then how can you establish viable relationships? So at minimum, I try to be a resource that helps to bring about viable dialogue so that we, who are members of this one human family, can move beyond the sin that constipates us from getting along and being real. Because we only have a short amount of time between the womb and the tomb. We are all terminal. The Bible says that we're all from dirt. Well, if we are from dirt, we don't have to be dirty. We can be a light to others. I try to be that light.
Allie?
Thank you. In terms of Change the Stories work, this past year in December, we released a brand new report about women's economic status in Vermont. And we made a concerted effort to include in that report, which is called the Women, Work, and Wages Report, to make a concerted effort to include greater diversity in that report. It was our 5th report that we've put out as an organization in the last 5 years on different topics. And in this report, we included a deeper breakdown of, for example, poverty rates in Vermont for women and how that is different based on race. And we see, based on what we know nationally, we saw similar effects in Vermont. That Black women, for example, face a poverty rate that's more than twice that of white women in the state. And we know that nationally the wage gap, for example, again is much more significant for women of color and particularly for Black women, as well as student debt. We took a look at spending, not just earning in this report, and we saw that for student debt, Black women actually carry the highest level of student debt overall, $8,700 more on average than white women, and nearly $1,800,000 more than Asian women. And so we wanted to include these findings because we want to take a deep look at what's happening here in Vermont in terms of race, which we hadn't done as deeply in our previous reports because we need to face that head on to be able to move forward. And so this report, it's worth taking a look at those statistics and that breakdown. And this is going to be a bigger part of our work moving forward, incorporating more intersectionality into our work, not just around race, but also around ability and other identities that impact people's ability to earn and what they're expected to spend as well. So.
Rhoni?
That's great.
Yeah, I heard actually an interesting statistic the other day, or not statistic, but fact, that Martin Luther King today would have been the same age as Barbara Walters. And I think in an education setting, a lot of times students feel so far removed from this topic of history when it's still so much a part of our day-to-day education system and needs to be more readily accessed and talked about and discussed in those uncomfortable conversations that we don't have enough of, especially in the education system. And I think there's opportunities we don't take. One of the lessons that I always learned, especially from Martin Luther King, was making sure of understanding why people live in poverty to really enact change within that, and understanding why those pockets of poverty exist more readily in certain areas, and why certain people live in generational poverty that's hard to get out of. And it's, one thing to enact charity to help, but it's another thing to be involved in the process of understanding. And we don't do that enough in an education setting. I think, you hear a lot of examples. I remember, being a student, and we went and had lunch in a soup kitchen one day, and that's just one way to look at that, but it's not a full way. And I remember a teacher saying there's more of these opportunities that are not used well in education settings to really get students to understand why this is created, how it happens. Why are, girls of color, especially in the education system, why is discipline higher, and how does that direct, their future outlook as we get older? And I think that's one thing within our work at Vermont Works for Women, as well as with Change the Story and other organizations, really looking at this and bringing light to these issues, because they have to be discussed in order to change.
Jeff, how does the holiday weave into your work?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind, especially when talking about the educational system in the state of Vermont. Too often people get away with thinking that we don't have to discuss these issues because, again, Vermont is so quote-unquote white. And because of that, therefore, we get a pass. Obviously, we don't get a pass. One could argue more than ever, or more so here than anywhere else, we have to be vigilant about learning about who Martin Luther King was. But let me just suggest that even when we talk about this perceived homogeneity, the reality is that in any classroom we walk into in the state of Vermont, I'm talking public classrooms, well, okay, so we walk into a classroom and 50% of the class is what? It's women, it's girls. Mm-hmm. So we're dealing with issues of gender right off. When we go into a typical classroom in Vermont, anywhere from 38 to 55 and higher of the percentage of kids on free reduced hot lunches. So we're dealing with issues of social class. Here in St. Albans, at the city elementary school in St. Albans, over 70% of the kids are on free and reduced hot lunches. Those are numbers that compare to a city, an urban city. And then there are issues of race. We walk into classrooms up here, the Abenaki, but if we were in the area like Barrie, we talk about the granite workers, the Italian. We go to Burlington and look at places like the Burlington High School, the number of languages that are spoken, the work that's done in Burlington around race. Winooski, 27 languages are spoken. So if we look at Vermont, again, a snapshot of any classroom in Vermont, we're dealing with issues of race, we're dealing with issues of social class, and we're dealing with issues of gender. And the reality is we're not doing enough. Given that this is the reality, these are the facts. These are who classrooms are comprised of. And yet, this is not how we approach it in the state of Vermont. So we have our work cut out for us. And I think that's what Martin Luther King was saying. We have our work cut out for us.
And I think just to that point real quick, another thing that's not discussed, and especially in Vermont, is privilege. Privilege is not discussed as part of what creates this problem. And I think that is something where it's an opportunity for students to better engage in these conversations in a manner that really can lead to change, because privilege is what also affects every one of those that walk into that classroom, into everyday communities.
And one more note just on the whiteness of Vermont. When we talk about Vermont being 92.5% white, that means that there are 40,000 people in this state who are not white. Mm-hmm. And that's a significant number. I mean, that's the size of one of Vermont's larger cities. So I just think it's incredibly important to put the numbers into people and not get lost in the statistics of it all. But really, that's 40,000 people, so it's a significant number of folks.
So I'm glad you guys bring up the Vermont demographic numbers. That's definitely something that I want to bring up in a minute or two. But since we do want this to be conversational, I was hoping that some of you may be able to educate me. So as a public school teacher, in the U.S. history classes that I've taught in the past, one of the numbers that I use for students to talk about how things are not okay or not as they should be is the pay gap. So, Allie, I'm just curious, do you have the most recent numbers as far as the pay gap, either in Vermont or for the entire country?
So the pay gap right now in Vermont, through our most recent statistics, is 16 cents on the dollar, which is the difference between what men and women make, and that's an average across race. Nationally, we have the statistics broken down by race, so I can give those for you as well. So in the United States, the pay gap is 22%. The rate is 16 points higher for Black and for Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander women at 38%, 42% for Native American women, and 46% for Hispanic and Latinx women.
In the classroom, the numbers are what they are, and you can only give the students the most accurate information. And that has always been one that I've pulled on to try to make the point that as much as we've achieved, there's still further to go. So.
And I think it's important also to note that that's for women working full-time compared to men working full-time. So that is not taking into consideration the fact that women do work at a higher rate at part-time jobs. But this is even not taking into account that. That's the wage gap that we see.
So now let's touch on demographics. Demographically, Vermont is one of the whitest states in the Union. How does that impact our awareness of race and equality issues? Roy?
I think a full understanding of what that statistic means in the context of who we are is very clear. Let me explain. To not educate our young people and parents to the reality that we are one among 8 billion people populating planet Earth is a tragedy, because even though we look at some 330 million people in America, some 660,000 people in Vermont, we're part of a greater whole. And one of the fastest growing demographics in Vermont is people of color. It's important for us to understand that and educate accordingly, because for us to become, that is, our young people, leaders of tomorrow, competitive in the big market, it's important for us to understand that we're part of this big whole. To focus only on our numbers in our landlocked Vermont says that we do a great disservice to the young people, to the country, and to the whole of the global when we do not recognize that we're part of a greater whole and have an opportunity to make a contribution. It's important to see where we can make that contribution. That education at, let's say, BFA, Bellows Falls Academy, Fairfax, where I am, says that we can have opportunities in the country and outside of the country because we're part of a greater whole. That demographic has to be brought to the table and to the discussion. And one of the ways it can be brought to the table and to the discussion, yes, we may be a majority on my block or in my county, but I see that the governor also has one of his commissioners who's a Native American, one of his commissioners in the governor's cabinet who's an African American, or some other person of color. That automatically goes beyond the American template that says, you gotta be white to be right, or you gotta be white in order to ascend to this level of both responsibility and accountability, and embracing that order which is inclusive, that order which I am just one among the many. There are still residuals going back to Native Americans in this country, wherein our government made over 500 treaties with Native Americans and then broke every one of them. that bait and switch continues on that level. And so when we look at a picture sends a message, subconscious and otherwise, and that picture says, oh, Democratic governor, oh, Republican governor, we have equality. No, we do not, because gender in Vermont, during the 32 years I have been here, my wife and I, gender in the governor's office says whether you're Democrat or you're Republican, it's all right if the diversity is all white. Those demographics are changing. Those demographics that we now engage and exercise do not speak to the reality. And truth is sort of like love. In many quarters, those are words that we stay away from, we the people. And we're more comfortable, seemingly, of finding someone to walk on, stand on, to marginalize, to oppress and abuse. We can make a difference, and we can make a difference. You know, King's speech way back when was, where do we go from here? Well, we have the opportunity, while we're still alive, to go from here. So, you know, I'm reading this book by Michael Eric Dyson. He says, what does truth sound like? We keep running away from the truth. As a result, we repeat the negative when we are in a positive to accentuate the positive.
Why is that, George? Why do you think that is?
Why do I think that is? Well, a lot of it is history. In 1597, when the British Parliament sent its criminal elements to this country, they got here coming out of a caste and class system where they were all white, and they said, how can we distinguish ourselves? How can we get out from under indentured servitude? We'll go to the black-white or the skin color issue. And so they went underground, so to speak, and then they continued to build upon this negativity. And it's that negativity and the violence within our country. I mean, we do some pretty violent things. Systematically, we can look at Native Americans. Systematically, we can look at African Americans. Systematically, we can look at people like Thomas Jefferson, who we have a monument to. But Thomas Jefferson decided that he wanted a teenager to sleep with. And, you know, think about that. And folks still validate him with a salute. But that was a teenager who was enslaved. And he didn't stop with his penetrations, because after the 6 children and after his death, he still in his will did not emancipate her. So we need a level of emancipation with the truth. And it's the truth that can be embraced, because many of our children in the statistics of today know the difference. They have emails and they communicate with people around the world. Many of them also, however, do not have the cognitive strength and foundation that enables them to make a difference between what is fake news and the truth. And they're looking for their role models, parents, adults. And as a result, they aren't getting that spiritual and physical and intellectual food that says, this is the truth and you can stand here. And as a result of not finding something to stand on, they fall. They fall for drugs. They fall for suicide. Right here in Franklin County, less than 10 students since October have committed suicide. And the state of Vermont's suicide is 25 times the national average. So, looking at statistics, back to your question, looking at the demographics, back to your question, looking at the truth. And that's what King was talking about. So we talked about truth not only in terms of, let's say, a lunch counter and desegregation, he also talked about truth in terms of militarism, in terms of poverty, in terms of, well, let's stick with militarism just as an example, and education. If our national budget would increase at the same level that we fund education, elementary school education, babysitting, child care education, college education, university education, research education, then we truly would be the model, I say, that we used to be for various countries around the world. At the moment, why is it that the death rate, estimated death span in America, is falling? So the question is, okay, more people are coming on planet Earth. At the time that I was in college, we didn't have iPads and we didn't have computers or a hand, whatever. So we've made progress. If we can make progress in those levels because of the brain power that comes from the collective, the inclusive collective of us in Vermont. I mean, come on. We took a lead in abolitionist activities. So if we can take a lead there, we have the power, and there is a will here to make a difference in those other levels. There's a new generation coming. Let's give them the knowledge that we gave the Apollo and others that sent people to the moon. Just think if we empower this new demographic with the same kind of respect and skill, how high the heights will go to make a difference from all. People are still looking to Vermont to help make a difference. The Ben and Jerry's were playing basketball and they said, we want some ice cream, we want something that's cool. And it mushroomed into a business that employs people nationally and internationally. So there are things that we can do because we who are part of the ongoing and increasing demographic that are beneficial. So we leave tracks in the sand for others to walk and paths in the sand for others to walk. And we can do that with the willpower and the mind power that is here. If I was in church, I'd say we have the mind of Christ. I can't say that, but I'm not totally wrong because our currency says, in God we trust.
Right.
Vermont is either the whitest state in the union or up there with some of the other states where our demographics have a certain history. So how does that impact your work?
Well, first of all, I really like what you said about how high can we go if we empower everyone, right? That's intriguing to me. That's inspiring and exciting to me because when I think about what is at stake if we do not accept this call to bring about greater equality. In terms of our report, we see that if men and women were to earn equal wages in Vermont, we would see an additional $1.2 billion added to the state economy annually, which is an enormous amount of money to leave on the table by not taking action. And I imagine that we would see a similar boost to the economy if people of all races were earning, not seeing a wage gap, a race-based wage gap as well. So that piece about what would it look like if we were to really take up this call to empower all and invest the resources, as you said, in education and more to make that a reality. That just is key to me. In terms of our work, one thing that is a challenge for us is just that to be able to say more about, we need better data collection in Vermont to be able to say anything about what's happening with folks of color here. And that, for example, we don't know how many state contracts are with minority or women-owned businesses in the state because we simply don't collect that data. And there are many more examples where the state could be doing more to collect the data so that we can talk about those pieces of our economy that we can then face the truth of where we are. And we may not want to look at the data because it may not look pretty for us, but face the truth of all right, are we contracting with entirely white men right now? Which may or may not be the case, I'm not sure, but to look at that and then move forward from there, because until we know what we're dealing with, as you're saying, to face the truth, it's very hard to move forward from that and to have an accountability and a processing.
So why doesn't that happen? Why don't we have data on that? It's supposed to be with federal programs, 10% set aside for minority hiring. That's been forever.
Yeah.
We took advantage of it in the Abenaki community years ago with the Agency of Transportation. And we were able to do some very, very exciting things. We pushed the state, but we had someone in transportation, Carol Witham, who was phenomenal. And this guy said, we're going to do the work we're supposed to be doing. All right, so he was saying this 25 or 30 years ago, we're going to do the work we're supposed to be doing, the 10% set aside. Well, where has that gone to?
Yeah.
You know, so many of those same programs are still there. And you've got to work hard at making it happen. But the point is, you can, and we should, and we don't.
Yes.
So that's the operative.
You can push for that, but it takes pushing for that.
Absolutely.
To get that. And I think, you know, related to this point, when looking at it from, you know, our work and we look at diversity at the table, we know what diversity can do as far as enacting change, both in a lot of different ways, but specifically to women, when we talk about non-traditional jobs and fields. You know, we have labor shortages in areas across the state right now, and you know, for example, construction sites are paying a lot more in overtime, for one, rather than changing, you know, the look of the construction site by adding more women or adding more, you know, jobs within that and changing maybe current cultures to make that more effective. But that also goes back to education. Of having diversity at the table is how you're really going to affect systematic change to really move things forward. And I think it does start young. We need to be having these conversations. And while, yes, I think in a lot of places across the state, we are one of the whitest states in the union, there's still ways to have these conversations. There's still ways to encourage diversity at the table. And there's still ways to push and make sure that our children, especially in the education system, are getting the full perspective of this issue and having these conversations. Because again, we'll maintain in this cyclical cycle if we don't have these uncomfortable conversations and start educating our youth more effectively on what's happening. And at a very basic, you know, this goes back to our textbooks and how across the country you can actually, as a state, choose to change the language of history within a textbook. And that's a problem when we're looking at educating the next generation and hoping that the next generation can come together if you're not even getting the same message from the same textbook.
One piece just on diversity, I was reading an article, which if you're watching now, you can look it up, that Vermont Digger just came out with quotes from a bunch of racial justice advocates around the state this morning to recognize Martin Luther King Day. And they had a quote from Susanna Davis, who's the new director of racial equity here. And she just said, you know, diversity is who you have around the table, and inclusion is, are they being listened to? Are we being listened to? Is it, you know, being incorporated, the feedback? And so that piece is incredibly important to me as well. Is, are we shifting our culture so that not only are people at the table, but that is being put into practice so that we can move forward.
And I think real quick, to make a quick point on that, when it comes to the pay gap too, that's one thing. It goes along this conversation. It's one thing to bring, you know, equity among the pay gap, is to bring that and let's close that, and that's going to do a lot for individuals to really move forward, but it's not the whole piece to really move this forward. And that's where that inclusion is. You know, we can pay women more in non-traditional fields, but it's not going to change the culture of what's out there that has systematically created what we're facing right now. And that's across many different fields.
Okay, so maybe before we move on, it's important for folks to realize that this is not part of some politically correct agenda, you know, that you know, has come upon us the last 10, 15 years because it's the right thing to do. Because we know a lot of critics would say that. No, in fact, Horace Kalin was a professor at Princeton, 1917. 1917, he coined the phrase cultural pluralism. So that was in response to what we call the melting pot notion of sameness. Melting pot was sameness. What Kalin and others were talking about was celebrating diversity. Was that something that was happening in 1920? No, it wasn't. So it's important to realize, though, that the meaning and context, when did this all start? It didn't happen just 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago. This has been going on for hundreds of years. Again, the thing is, you know, why haven't we seen the kind of movement that we'd like to be able to see? Jim Loewen was a professor of sociology at the University of Vermont, and he taught a course called The Lies That My Teachers Taught Me. It was powerful 30 years ago when he taught it, and it's just as powerful today. Just as powerful when people say, well, why? What happened to Christopher Columbus Day? You know, why are we going with this thing, Indigenous Peoples Day? What is that all about? Again, that politically correct agenda No, it's not. It's looking at the facts and responding to them. And yet this is what we're still mirrored in, which is, that sensibility, which has to change. Your words were really, really powerful. They're stirring. And yet, how is this going to happen? How is it going to happen in this state, much less in this country? But let's start here. Let's start at home. And how are we going to make those changes happen so that equity becomes something that we can really talk about for generations to come? And right now, it's a tough road to hoe.
And I think that part of that, you're so on target there, is the denial motif that is so much part of our culture, the denial that has been normalized. Here's an example. Now, with my mom, I mentioned to you, I'm from the state of, even though I've been here 32 years, but my roots, I was born in Tennessee. Today, Tennessee is, at the time, my mom was in boarding school, and she and her classmates saw the white leaders of the country come in at midnight and take the dean away. They found his body later, of course, lynched, and that old American castration. I don't know why white folk are preoccupied with castrating black men. The body is dead, leave it alone. What are you trying to resurrect? So that was when she was in boarding school. 1940, they established, they killed him to send a message to the black community, which was, we hear there's going to be an NAACP chapter, and we're sending a message that we don't want an NAACP branch in Brownsville, Tennessee, Haywood County. Well, in 1940, they finally established a chapter. Then they killed Mr. Williams, Albert Williams, who was, I think, the first NAACP martyr in our country. Well, you say, well, that was during the times of your mom. That was in the 1940s. That's gone away. Really? Mm-hmm. 2004, James L. Hart, after his advocacy for eugenics and racism, won the primary in Tennessee, Haywood County. He is considered one of the top 12 most racist politicians in the modern era. The man made his statement. You can go online. Anybody who's watching this program will see that. I'm saying that that same sin is among us. It's important for us to recognize that truth and move beyond denial. Because, it's like AA. I think that's what Alcohol Anonymous is. Your first step is to acknowledge the truth. Then you start to move with respect to. I'm not talking about tokenism, all right? We find a lot of people across the country, and even here in a small state like Vermont, you find in Vermont a number of people from other cities come and they bring tapes. There's negative tapes which are still playing in their heads. And one is that, if we're going to have diversity and if we're going to have inclusion around the table, they must be a light-skinned black. A number of people say the only reason that Barack Obama was elected is because he was a fair-skinned black. He was like Senator Brooks out of Massachusetts. What helped him out was his wife. She was a dark-skinned black. And folks say, okay, we can have black and white at the table at the same time. The reality of acknowledging what black folk, white folk, and other folk of color bring to the table begins that stride. And we have to begin. I'm reading this book here. I apologize for going on. This guy's going to be at UVM this coming month. And I would recommend Abram Kendry go to his lecture. There's an introductory statement here that I think is so fitting. He says, quote, Americans like to insist that we are living in a post-racial and colorblind society. In fact, racist thought is alive and well. It has simply become more sophisticated and more insidious. Kendry argues in his book, racist ideas in this country have a long and lingering history, one in which nearly every great American thinker is complicit. complicit. You say nearly everyone is complicit. That's denial. The truth, the folk have said, sets us free. And you are raising the kind of question that the truth must be addressing.
So can I follow up on that? As a teacher in the public school system in 2020, the term white privilege, the effort just to get people to think in those terms, I was wondering if each of you could tackle today something that sometimes I struggle with in the classroom. How do you get, or do you think the average Vermonter even understands what that term means? Any of you?
I don't think any person fully understands their level of privilege until they experience what it's like to have that taken away. And so I think that's a continual lesson for each individual to understand, but also confront. And I think we're at a place right now where we need to be confronting what that looks like and really listening and understanding what it looks like when you don't have that type of privilege. And so, no, I don't believe that every Vermonter, even outside of the state of Vermont, fully understands what that looks like or has those discussions to really get to the level of understanding. But I think there's opportunity too, but I don't believe at this point we fully dive into that conversation of privilege.
Jeff?
Well, you mentioned that during the public school. So let's look at something like kids are graduating, seniors are graduating, and they're very preoccupied with their GPA. And they take courses, and kids in the top of the class take courses that they think are harder, so therefore should get more of a ranking than the others. So a 4.0 is not enough. It should be a 4.2 or 4.3. These are kids that don't even begin to understand what this is all about. They feel we live in a meritocracy, and a meritocracy, you earn your just desserts, and anything other than that, they feel we're just pandering. We're pandering. Affirmative action is pandering. I mean, we can take any of the terms that we use philosophically, and no, I don't think the kids get it. And then we look at well, where do they learn? They learn at the kitchen table from their parents, and I don't really think that we're even close to being there when we talk about the tenets and the demands of a democracy. And what are those demands? All we've ever said about the Abenaki, for instance, is that we want to create environments where kids and their families can make choices, where it's not going to be the system dictating to them what's going to be. But any school where we still have things we call the tracking system are racist in nature. Racism, and it's alive and well. We track in schools, and who are in the college tracks? The people of privilege. And who are in the general track? The poor people. We do a great job of creating, by the time kids graduate from school, those are going to lead and manage, and those are going to be the followers. And that's what we do. A guidance counselor who should be saying to all youngsters, we want to work with you, because all youngsters are from at promise, an at promise paradigm rather than the at risk paradigm that's still used to this day. Although I did see California is doing away with that. They're doing away with the notion of at risk. And they'll go with the at promise, because we want school to be a strengths-based approach for all kids. We look for the strengths, or at least that's what we should be doing, but we don't. So when you ask, do I think that we're doing it? No, I don't believe so, and I don't believe that we're even close to doing so. I mean, I think that that as long as we're just we're playing and it's okay, it doesn't truly challenge us in our basic beliefs, then we're okay. But as soon as people feel the least bit threatened, threatened by what, then boom, they react to what feels best.
And what I see is a gut reaction that my place in society or my success in society, it's not because I took advantage of somebody else or somebody else didn't get the opportunities that I did. And it's just having that conversation about history and the math and the numbers. And as a teacher, I struggle with even getting people to think about that. So, Allie?
Yeah, Yeah, I'll speak from my experience working with Showing Up for Racial Justice on this one. And we work with a number, or have worked with in the past, a number of student-run, kind of racial justice-oriented student groups. And, you know, I've been continually impressed by the level of reading that these youth leaders are taking up, the level of education that they're taking on to conduct with their peers, holding, you know, big auditorium discussions and panels, having small group talks with their peers about what is it that we're talking about, and you know, what is privilege, what can we do in our schools to make things better for the students of color and the leadership that they're taking. So I do see a lot of hope, especially in central Vermont where I'm based, around the youth leadership that's happening. And part of our work as Showing Up for Racial Justice is to provide them with resources and support, and for them to know that there are allies who are willing. We've come in to help them lead workshops and you know, provide some emotional support and mentorship as they try to do this really hard stuff as well, and connect them with adult leaders of color in the community as well, so that they can get support from them as well. So I have a lot of hope for the next generation who are taking these leadership roles, and I imagine you see some of these youth as well taking action. So that's exciting to me. And some of the resources that we offer that I'll just share with you and for folks who are watching as well that may be of interest to read are Unpacking the Invisible Backpack, which works through, you know, looks at some of the different pieces of, you know, the backpack is like what you carry, what kind of privilege do you have, or what kind of hardship do you have that is just with you at all times, and kind of depersonalizing it, so it's not, oh, you're taking advantage of someone as a privileged person. It's not that you individually are doing bad stuff to other people that causes them to, you know, you're intentionally stepping on somebody's shoulders to get ahead, but rather the systems are set up so that you, coming from your background, just have a head up just because of where you come from. And then it's your responsibility to take action from that place. So that one, and also just an article called I think it's Explaining White Privilege to a Broke White Person, looking at the race and class dynamics as well. You know, we can be broke as all get out and still carry white privilege, and that, I think, is really hard for folks to wrap their heads around, because it's like, you know, I don't have privilege, I don't have money, I don't have health care, I don't, you know, all the daily challenges of life, and yet still there's this extra privilege that comes being a white person without money versus being a person of color without money. So those are two resources that we recommend to folks, and I hope people will look them up.
So, do we understand white privilege?
Three responses to that. I'm talking about systemic oppression and systemic constipation in our country. One, many of us saw the movie, the Titanic, and we know the story. Research says that the power brokers locked the marginalized and, quote, poor people in the bottom of the boat so that they would not compete for the lifeboats, etc. So they were locked in. They had no opportunity whatsoever, even though everybody was killed. But the fact is, they were locked in. They were locked in. In this country, in Vermont in particular, we hear phrases such as flatlander. That's a reference to people who've come to Vermont and then they turn their noses down at others. And responding to that, I say, how can you be a flatlander when Native Americans were here before you got here? They have a history that's some 12,000 years old. But you've taken upon yourself with your guns and your power to deny that reality. Denying that reality says things to me and others such as, Roy, when you leave the house in the morning, there's no guarantee that you're going to come back alive. You don't have to process that as a white person. Your parents do not have to have that, quote, talk with you about where you can go and you can't go. I'm an African American, thanks be to God, as a member of the human family. But I know, you mentioned Larry McCory. When I got here, I had this conversation with Dr. Larry McCory about exploring nature's beauty in the whole state of Vermont, and there were places that I wanted to go. And I mentioned a particular county and a particular community. He says, you don't go up there. You're a black man. You may not return. Black folk don't go up there. They don't like black people, period, in that part of the country, that part of Vermont. So you have that privilege which says, I can deny that reality, and I still can move forward, like Native Americans were denied, like, and the systemic indoctrination of the systems go forth. So when you're born into that system, and it's white controlled, white dominated, you already have the privilege.
And to extend the Titanic metaphor, we talk about being on the Titanic, and the reality is all we do when you talk about white privilege, let's say, all we're doing now, we rearrange the furniture on the Titanic, but that's all we're doing. We're rearranging. We're not getting to the root causes. We're not getting to, like, you know, why the Titanic went down. And until we're dealing with the root causes, you know, and we're able to look at this systemically and understand these are structural inequities, structural injustice, then we're just basically spinning our wheels. And we are. We can feel good about some of the things that we're doing, but we're not affecting the kind of change that Dr. King talked about.
And I think, too, real quick on this point, I think it's also got to hear from a youth in a Burlington School District high school talking about trying to affect change within her high school. And while she has so much momentum behind her, she still struggles with even getting her classmates to be on the same page with her, and what that looks like and how daunting it feels like you're alone. And, you know, listening to her have this conversation, we just heard from her the other day, and she's dealing with conversations at a dinner table that she doesn't get to be a part of. And that's what she's trying to break down in her school day each day, is trying to shed light on this. But it was really encouraging to hear from her, but also really, you saw what an uphill battle that was as a youth right now, feeling like you don't, and she brought this up, feeling like she doesn't have a legal fight in this game because she's not voting age yet to enact change, and yet not realizing the power that she really has and what she's trying to do with just changing conversations in the school hallways.
And one more piece on this, like, structural question. Martin Luther King, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign, and the continued work now to extend that effort and to bring together working class people of all colors to pick that campaign right back up where it started, to fight for universal health care, to fight for a fundamental shift in the way that we do things so that we do not need to have, you know, so that we have enough lifeboats so there's not even an instinct to shut some people out, as was done on the Titanic, you know, because we have enough resources for everyone, and there's like a greed that happens, and we need to fundamentally shift the structures that allow that to continue. So I'm curious if either of you have some more experience recently with the Poor People's Campaign, but
I think what's important here is to remember Dr. King's speech there on the eve of his assassination. And the quote from part of it, he says, "What's going on? What's this all about? We don't have to live like we are forced to live." Now, what does all this mean in this great period of history? It means that we've got to stay together. We've got to stay together and maintain unity. Let us rise up with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination, and let us move on these powerful days, these days of challenge to make America what it ought to be. We have an opportunity to make America a better nation. We can't squander that opportunity.
So in the classroom, I always regret when class discussion has gone extremely well. and we have to cut it off because the tone is approaching. But our time is almost up. I wanted to give everybody an opportunity just for a closing remark, and either how we celebrate Martin Luther King Day or something that is associated with race and equality. So Jeff, we'll start off with you.
You know, I think that what we've done here, we've barely touched the surface, and that's so unfortunate. It's so frustrating because there's so much that we can do, and we've got an audience. I think that's a willing audience. They're going to watch this and you know, want to learn from it. I mean, I think the important thing is we look at Dr. King. I want to bring that up to the Abenaki. And for many, many years, people thought the way the Abenaki went about things was through violence, and that the leader was a guy named Homer St. Francis. And what he did was advocate through violence. That nothing could be further from the truth. From an activist perspective and from the strategizing, what we were looking at was a page right out of Dr. King, right out of Gandhi. I mean, in terms of civil disobedience, everything that we did, and back then, with things like hunting without licenses, it was fishing without licenses, it was getting Abenaki in court so we could fight the case in court. That's what we looked to do. And Jason, you probably have read about it if you don't remember the famous case, Elliott versus the state, and 77 Abenaki were cited to go into court. They got tickets, and they were ticketed because they fished without license plates. And when I look at what you were just saying in terms of where we are now, I was watching something earlier. Al Sharpton was talking. The Reverend Sharpton was saying that when he looks at it today versus, let's say, 20 years ago, he says, I'm talking to people that I would not have talked to 20 years ago. So there is a coming together. The unity that you speak to, that he says is encouraging, that we've got to be able to do that, that now more than ever, we have to be able to do that. And there are pieces all over that would indicate we can do it. I mean, we've got to be very, very, I think, so intentional in what we're doing. But as he said, is it possible? It's possible. We're going to have to roll up our sleeves and do the kinds of things we haven't done in a long time. Absolutely. But I think the future of our country certainly depends on what we do in November of 2020. It really depends on what we do. And it's that scary.
I would agree. I echo so much of what Jeff and others at the table have said. You know, I'm encouraged by these conversations happening more often, but I still think they need to be more uncomfortable and more in depth, and there needs to be more of an intentionality to continue the conversations to really try to get to the root of some sort of systematic change to move forward, and really looking at our education systems and our educators, and as a, citizen of our communities, and as a, nonprofit leader, and as somebody who's really trying to work boots on the ground to move this forward, engaging more people within this conversation is really where I see it. And I do see hope again, but I still think there's a long, long way to go in this whole discussion. And I think there's points of today that I wish we could have, been able to dive deeper into.
Allie?
Thank you all for a great conversation. Glad to be here with you this morning. And there's so much to gain. That's what I'm walking out of, this conversation with, is that by approaching these issues with open minds, we have a heck of a lot to gain as a statewide community by being more equity focused, and by continuing the work of Martin Luther King all year round, around looking at structural shifts to change the way we run our economy and our systems, also of just relationship to one another, and healing what has happened in our communities over the last however long. So I wanted to just express appreciation for the examples that you brought in today that are harrowing, and just the reality of that. I'm glad to have that your input at the table.
Roy, final thoughts?
And I think everybody at the table, one of the things I said to you was that I look to learn, and there's learning that takes place in community and unity. And my closing remark in response to your question comes, if you will, from where do we go from here? That's the title of Dr. King, one of his books, and at the same time, he spoke using that title before the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And therein, he talks about, and the symbolic of that, because symbolism of that, because you remember that there was a woman who tried to kill him by stabbing him in the chest when he was what do you do when you're China? Autographing, when he was autographing his book. But there was fear, and danger in what we're talking about. But he went beyond that. He survived it, which symbolically speaks to us that we have to step out in spite of the fear of the negativity, the sin that is speaking to us. And what he said at that conference, and I think it's important because it speaks to us right now, quote from his speech, "This is a time for action. This is no time for romantic illusions and empty philosophical debates. What is needed is a strategy for change. Without recognizing this, we'll end up with solutions that don't solve, answers that don't answer, and explanations that don't explain."
To wrap up, I want to thank you all for being a part of this discussion. I want to thank you guys for watching. And I know in 18 years in the classroom, this is probably the most meaningful Martin Luther King Day related thing that I've been involved in. So thank you for watching. Jason Barney signing off.
Thank you.
Thank you.